A very warm welcome. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Henry Timms. I'm the Executive Director of the 92nd Street Y.
And I'm Jeremy Heimans, the CEO of Purpose.
And Jeremy and I come at the world from very different places. I run an 141-year-old institution on the Upper East Side of New York, which serves our local community, but is trying to reimagine our work all over the world. And Jeremy
runs Purpose, which is a home for movement building, for campaigns and new forms of public mobilization on big global issues and national issues like gun violence.
And when we were thinking and talking about our work in such different places, we kept struggling with something. We kept thinking about the future and trying to understand what was going to happen next, and coming up against barriers of language. And the thing we hear about most is the idea of the 2.0 world. So all of us here have heard about finance 2.0 or education 2.0 or technology 2.0. So I wanted to start with this. This is, if we have a working clicker.
There we are.
Perfect.
Brilliant.
This is Microsoft 1.0. Are you ready? This is Microsoft 2.0. Let's do that twice so we can see the huge difference. Microsoft 1.0, Microsoft 2.0. This is precisely how we often think about the future. We think about doing exactly the same things, but layering on a bit more technology. We think to ourselves, we've got trouble ahead, let's hire a chief digital officer. But what we decided to start thinking through was the idea that the change we should anticipate is not about technology. The change we need to think through is about something much more significant which is changing, and that's power.
And so we want to introduce you to a framework today, old power meet new power. And this is an article that Henry and I published in Harvard Business Review late last year, which laid out a way, a lens, a vocabulary in quite a lot of detail to think about how power in the world is shifting. And so this is new power in action, right? New power is clearly evident in this rising political dissent, in the increase in political protest that we see all over the world. Some of that is electing people president of the United States when someone like Barack Obama uses a crowdfunding infrastructure, uses a much better grassroots infrastructure to eclipse Hillary Clinton in the 2008 primaries and ultimately be elected president. You see it in the emergence of movements like Black Lives Matter and political insurgents all over the world who have no formal political apparatus but are going straight to the crowd, straight to mass mobilization as a means of achieving power. You see it in models like Airbnb in the economy. So Airbnb is a model where without a single square foot of physical infrastructure, this has become the largest source of accommodation in the world. How? By making it very easy for people to coordinate their own apartments and their own homes without any top-down infrastructure required. You see it in models that are now emerging in finance. This is Lending Club, which actually now facilitates billions of dollars of loans, effectively kind of disintermediating the oldest of old power institutions, the bank, the thing that we thought we could never do without.
So how does this break down? We tried to put together a taxonomy about how do we think about this world. So the old power world thinks about power as a currency. It's zero sum. I've got it, you haven't. The new power world sees power as a current. It's not something you ever truly own, but it's something you can shape. The old power world was typically held by few. But in the new power world, we see things being made by many. The old power world had this instinct to download. It wanted to tell the world what to do. Well, the new power world works out the right context to encourage people to make their own choices. The old power world would always command. It was very leader-driven. The new power world runs on something else. The new power world is run by people who share. It's ruled by people who come together not by the superstar leaders, but by groups of dynamic peers. And ultimately, the old power world would always default to closed. It wanted to close things up. It wanted to capture. What the new power world is trying to do is to open things up.
So in Harvard Business Review, we sort of identified some of the models and the behaviors that are emerging in this new context, right? So you think of what most business models required of you in an old power context. And that was basically to consume, right? You know, buy this newspaper, buy this pair of shoes, you know, listen to my radio show, right? The agency of us was limited to an ask to consume. Whereas these new power models are based on asking us to do behaviors that require a higher degree of participation, right? So sharing, very much a model that Facebook relies on, asks us to kind of share and spread. Without that behavior, Facebook wouldn't have scale, right? Shaping, there's a huge amount of activity now going on all around us where people are taking someone else's idea or content and remixing it and adapting it. That's the backbone of platforms like YouTube. You see funding models, right, which is quite frankly, quite a new behavior that's emerging, where people are effectively endorsing things with money. And so you have a model like Kickstarter, which is now raising billions of dollars for the arts and actually eclipsing some government funding models which do the same thing from the top down. You have models that require people to share their own time or to produce real assets in the context of a peer community. And in a moment, we'll hear from a panelist, Scott Heiferman, who runs Meetup, which is an extraordinary company that enables people to meet offline and essentially organize in local groups. You see it in platforms like Etsy, where people are sharing crafts and arts, or in models like Airbnb. And ultimately, you have models where there's actually co-ownership of the members of the movement or the peer-based community in what's produced and in the value. So you think of a model like Wikipedia, where really the people who are making Wikipedia are co-owning the value produced in a quite profound way. So my clicker still doesn't work. So you see this then manifest in values, right? So you can think of those behaviors as the basis of the business models that are emerging in a new power world. But you also see this very interesting clash of values. And you don't have to kind of like some of these new power values, but this is what a lot of people who are engaging in these models now believe. And so, for example, on the question of governance, these new power actors tend to favor very informal, very networked forms of governance that are based on self-organization. And they're eschewing some more traditional 20th century ideas around managerialism, around formal representative governance. So a way to think about it, given that we're close to the General Assembly today, is that the new power crowd would probably not have invented the United Nations, right? They're more flash mob than they are General Assembly, with all of the things that come with that, good and bad. On the level of values, there's this intrinsic belief in collaboration, participation, the wisdom of the crowd as a kind of end in itself. Whereas if you think about the 20th century, being a good and ruthless competitor, for example, was how you got ahead in the finance industry, right? Whereas today, many of these new power models are kind of supercharging collaborative behavior. In other words, you're going to be a very unsuccessful Uber driver if people rate your reputation down. So being collaborative, being open, as an Airbnb host, if you promise really fancy bath products and you deliver really unfancy ones, well, ultimately, you're going to be punished by the community. There's also obviously this belief in transparency as a kind of end in itself. And that's quite different to the 20th century notion that, well, maybe the best way to get business done is for gentlemen to sit behind closed doors and kind of come to their agreements. Very, very different orientation. So we'd see this reflected in a whole bunch of different ways. And I think one of the most interesting ways this is manifesting is at the level of people's attitude to participation and affiliation. So we see today a lot more participation, a lot more affiliation. But that affiliation is much more transient, right? People used to have cards in their wallet. They were members of civil society organizations for years and years, decades. And today, people join, but that membership is much more transient. And that requires you to build quite different models.
So the way that one interesting exercise is to ask the millennials in your life which side of this chart they identify with. I think you'll get a clear response. So if you write an article for Harvard Business Review, you actually have to legally do at least one 2x2 matrix. This was ours. So along the bottom here, we were looking at the old power values. So what are those organizations which have old or new power values? And on the vertical, we were looking at models. We were thinking to ourselves, do you have an old or a new power model? So we're going to finish with just a couple of examples to start thinking about where you would plot yourself and your organization on this chart. I think also, where do you want to get to over the next 5 years? So think about Apple. Apple's the greatest new technology companies. Apple's an old power organization, right? Apple, in an interesting way, is very closed systems. Apple, in a very interesting way, has made a good point recently about it's just a product. It doesn't want your data. It's not trying to invade in your life in interesting ways. So the idea that new technology equals new power is not right. And neither is the idea that new technology is necessary. New power is always a great success. Look at something else. We all remember the Obama campaign. Yes, we can, right? The most extraordinary surge of new power, both in its model and its value. One of the challenges for the campaign was once they hit government, the realities of the old power superstructure hit in. So we saw a shift from a campaign that was very much new power to an administration that was challenged to bring the new power they had in campaigning into office. And as we look across the wider world, we can see a world beginning to shape out where different organizations are working out their futures by plotting out how much new power they need, where they need it, and what that's going to mean for the future. And that's what we're going to talk about with our panelists today.
And so I think one more slide. And so that's the context for purpose, which is essentially a home for kind of building these new power models, right? So we think about problems that require a large base of well-organized people who are mobilized to act and who embody some of these new power values. And we build those models, right? And we do that on issues like climate change. We've been very involved in building international public support for refugees on the Syrian crisis. And we work with partners like Everytown, Michael Bloomberg's organization around gun violence. Because if you think about the NRA, and it's a very timely time to talk about this, of course, unfortunately, the NRA is a very powerful grassroots organization. The reason they have power is they have millions of people who can mobilize essentially at a moment's notice to build political power on that issue. And so the imperative for an organization like Everytown is to build that same kind of new power that's well organized, that's technology enabled, so that at moments of crisis like the one we're in now, we can really have those people be organized in a meaningful way to make the case for sensible laws that actually control and contain the madness of gun violence in America. So that's a little bit about how our organization works, and I think we're now going to jump to the panel. Thanks so much.
Do you want to introduce me?
And I'm going to call folks up. I'm going to call up Nancy Lublin, who's the founder and CEO of Crisis Text Line, and also recently the CEO of DoSomething.org. We have Scott Heiferman, who is the co-founder and CEO of Meetup.com, which I mentioned a moment ago. We have Jonathan Greenblatt, who is the National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, and until recently at the White House. And we have Jenny Abramson, who's the founder and managing director of Rethink Impact, which is an impact investing fund that she'll tell you about. So thanks, guys, for joining the conversation. We're looking forward to this. I'm going to start with Scott, given that I queued you up in the talk. So, Scott, you're an interesting company because you sort of have tried very hard to be a tech company that has kept both your new power model, which is all about enabling people to meet offline, and your new power values. Do you think all tech companies are doing that, right? So you think about a Facebook who seems to have a very successful new power model, but are they really embodying the values of their community and feeding the agency of their community? So I'm curious your take on some of those companies, or a company like Uber.
Yep. Pomegranate. So, funny, I'm so glad that the Harvard Business Review required the 2x2 because I love it. It's a great model to think about these really important thoughts that Henry and Jeremy are bringing up. So I love that question, Jeremy. Thanks. It's fascinating that these companies that are doing a fantastic job at decentralizing, empowering people, like Airbnb, empowering people to make money and find these rooms that weren't previously available, and Uber empowering people to make money for the riders to find the drivers, and the drivers to find the riders. It's fantastic. It is it's a true revolution. But the question that is one that is fascinating to me, and a prediction for the future, is that the centralized companies, the centralized authorities, are going to become incredibly powerful, because the network effects, as these networks get denser and denser, it just becomes inevitably powerful. But there's this other force happening, which is that the networks, the technologies can be thinner and thinner and thinner, such that the actual ability to disrupt these intense centralized networks it means it's going to get interesting. So I don't even whether that means a kind of a unionized version of whether the drivers essentially create a co-op unionized model. I know that might sound crazy because Uber is so powerful, but it's very real and it's going to get interesting. And so as you think about it on that matrix, you realize that some of the most empowering and decentralizing forces are actually ripe for disruption in the years ahead.
So, Jonathan, you've just come out of the White House.
Yep.
You've just taken on the Anti-Defamation League as its new CEO. One of the questions I think we're all interested in is how do these old power organizations begin to make the shift? Right? And I think a lot of people in the audience will feel that they are in an old power kind of an organization. How do you start to make that shift? What worked at the White House, and how are you thinking about ADL going forward?
Sure. Well, I'll give you, it's a good question, Henry, and I think there's a real challenge on hand is how our institutions, be they corporations or nonprofits or government, evolve and iterate relative to new technologies and changing times. So at the White House, the president prioritized innovation, and I can give you two examples of specific initiatives that related to that I think are consistent with your ideas of new power. So number one was the creation of the We the People function on the White House website. This is the idea of crowdsourcing ideas into the government. The president acknowledging that we don't have the best ideas. The best ideas are out there among hundreds of millions of Americans. So he created an online petition where Americans literally could propose ideas and then vote on them in much the same way we see on sites like change.org or Care2. So what's very interesting about that is that became so popular early on. The initial threshold for an idea to go from We the People to the president's desk was, I think, 15,000 signatures. Then it moved up to 25, 50, 100,000 because we had so many votes from people about a range of topics. And it led to some policy change. The president issued a policy to unlock cell phones. That came from We the People, a petition. The president pushed to ban conversion therapy, this idea that you could turn LGBT young people. That also came from We the People. So it has been a source for ideas and policy, again, admitting that we don't have all the answers inside government. The answers are out there. So at ADL, which is a 100-year-old institution, which is rooted in the fight against anti-Semitism. I mean, since the crucifixion, there's been anti-Semitism, lodged against the Jews. But in fact, our leadership walked with Dr. King 50 years ago across that bridge in Selma. And our leadership has fought with the Latino community for decades on immigration reform. And so we're firmly planted in the fight against bigotry and broader civil rights. So then the question becomes, how do we adopt these technologies and these new strategies to adjust to a new power environment? And I would say the jury's still out. But we're deeply engaged in using communication tools internally like Slack and other models, and externally thinking about online giving and strategies to use social organizing tools like Meetup so we can do a better job of connecting with the innovation, the talent that's out there.
Nancy, I've got a question for you, which is really within the domain of the NGO. So you took on Do Something, which when you joined it as CEO, was actually a relatively traditional NGO. You kind of transformed it into a really powerful new power network, right? I'd love to hear people, for you to sort of tell that story and what you learnt about the different expectations young people have about their own agency.
That basically it was just, there was no business model. It would do anything for money. We actually hadn't filed a Form 990 in 2 years. It was more like a knitting circle than a board. It was really a mess, which unfortunately I think people think of as the traditional not-for-profit model, right? Some of you are smiling. So I'm really funny. Anyway, so yeah, and the notion was we were going to go through schools and through teachers and principals to get kids to do good stuff. And it was the year after Friendster, the year before Facebook, and I said, you know what, we're going to shut down all these local offices and put everything online, because I think the internet's probably here to stay.
Good call.
Yeah. I was long on the internet. And so, yeah, so we flipped the entire model, and now Do Something is 4.3 million members. That's actually bigger than the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts combined, because there is such agency with young people, and maybe also because we're not homophobic.
That's helpful. So we'll come back to that, because I think there's some really interesting lessons in it. I want to turn to Jenny, and then we're going to have a a conversation with the whole group. So Jenny, you're a real pioneer in the impact investing space, but you're approaching that, I think, in a very sophisticated and more new power way than most. So I'd love for people to hear about what you're doing, and also kind of thinking about how you bring some of these new power models and values to a space, investing, which has traditionally been, pretty traditional.
Sure. Yes, impact investing and all investing has been very traditional, mostly New York-based originally. And even as impact investing grew, it would often be one wealthy person who had made a lot of money, wanted to give back, and they would create a fund that they owned and they controlled. And that did amazing things for the world. And the question became, why not democratize that? Why not give everyone access to the kinds of deals that they could have? So in Rethink Impact, what we've essentially done is tried to do that. So we have a fund that anyone in this room can own, and we are in some of those hot deals that traditionally no one was in. So if you take a change.org that you might have an Arianna Huffington or you might have a Reid Hoffman or others in, we own part of it. So if anyone here says, I want to buy part of Rethink Impact, they become equity holders to your model in that fund and in those companies. Purpose, another company, any of you can actually own Jeremy. No, I'm just kidding. We think that kind of model is the future of allowing everyone access. Beyond that, we've sort of turned something on its head, which is some of our leaders in the fund are the very CEOs in this space. So people like Jeremy and Rachel from Catch a Fire, who you may have heard yesterday, are actually guiding us to know what's really happening on the ground. So instead of thinking that we're wise finance people sort of in a tower, they tell us what's happening. They help collaborate. They work together to get us on the front end of the best deals and the best things. And we think you can both make more money this way, but also have a greater impact. So we're excited about the shift that's happening.
Great. So maybe we can sort of launch into a conversation about some of the underlying thoughts.
So I have a question for everyone, which is kind of the theme of all this on a practical level. And what's so interesting about this particular panel is these are all practitioners, right? One of the, we are a world full of thought leaders, not as many practitioner leaders, which is people who have actually done it. So the question I have for all of you is, you've built models which have more participation. That's what you spend your time thinking about. What lessons have you learned from those models which can help people in the room? So how do you get more people to participate in the right ways in your mission?
I think whenever there's a challenge, people tend to think of, well, we need to hire someone else or we need to outsource. You basically, whenever you have a challenge, you've got people, policies, and products that you can look to solve an agency issue. And I think old power type organizations think people. We need this particular partnership, or we need to hire this person, or we need a study that's done. And actually, our instinct is to build products. Both DoSomething.org and Crisis TechSign are tech companies. A third of our team writes code. And so we actually go first probably to products. What features can we build? What products can we build that create more agency at the bottom rather than at the top? The good thing about that is it's faster and cheaper than people, typically, depending upon how you build.
So ironically, my dream scenario is that we end up coming at it the opposite way eventually, which is we partner with the biggest, most bureaucratic institutions you can think of, and we help them give access, and we help them embrace the new power. So we, in my dream world, we come at it, ironically, we say to a big bank, yes, put this on your platform, let anyone that's part of your bank be part of this. And then on the flip side, we invest in organizations and social enterprises that actually are giving that power to the masses. So that's my hope, and I think Nancy's right. If you can do it through product and then actually partner on both ends, you really can turn the whole thing on its head.
Let me add something, and I'm going to turn it back on our wonderful moderators here. Well, the general question is: Are we talking about a revolution or not? What's the world we want? So. You lay out a case, we're saying nice things, but like, at the most general level, the fact that we're all sitting here and like you guys are in nice tidy rows, I can't even see you because the lights are on us and we're here, and then people shuffle in and shuffle out up top. You know, one of my takes on this new power model, which is the topic here, is that people are turned to each other. So, people wonder, how did Meetup get, how is it there's 25 million members with 20,000 meetups happening every day? It's because the whole essence of it, like everything else in the examples they brought up to idealize, is that it's not about, people are not the audience. People are are turned to each other. I mean, I really feel like you can model the 20th century as like this people standing in some circle, but they're not turned to each other. They're turned away from each other, and they're looking at big media and big banks and big box stores and big pharma and big everything. And that serves well to those of you who are building big companies and and are trying to build big companies you're trying to sustain. But really, like, serious value and serious, like, attention and change and real change on how people spend their time and think about their life is coming from the fact that YouTube they're not turned to big media, they're turned to each other. Kickstarter, they're funding each other. Meetup, they're meeting up with each other. On Twitter and Facebook, they're entertaining each other, and they're liking each other. So the last just word is how can you empower people to actually really turn to each other? That doesn't just mean like Coca-Cola can put some stupid bottle that like has a person's name on it, like it's personalized or customized. But really, how do you unlock that most beautiful thing in the world, which is people turn to each other?
Just to build on that, I think what Scott's touching on, consumers today are all about authenticity. So I think there's this massive pushback on corporate and big, and people are responding to not just small, but real. And in a world with social media where there are hundreds of millions of tweets hitting us every single nanosecond of the day, people are searching for the real and the authentic. And I'll tell you something, her crowd, if you will, she's the chief old person, at least for another few weeks, to do something, right? Young people today, they're not just 18 to 34, our children up here, all of us have young kids. They like have filters built into their brains. They see what's fake in ways that you probably don't. They have this they see the spectrum differently. So I think why YouTube is so powerful, I think why things like Do Something have taken off, because they tap into this desire for authenticity. And if your brands don't get that, if your businesses don't get that, you won't make it in like the next epoch.
One of the interesting themes of what's coming out of this is this distinction between structural new power and symbolic new power, right? So every organization in the world right now is saying, we're all about the crowd, we're all about engagement, we want to engage. We can all build the symbols easily. What builds hard is the structures, right? What actually builds hard is the models that drive those things. I wonder, Nancy, would you just talk for a minute about Crisis Text Line? Because I think as a kind of new power model, it taught me a lot.
Yeah.
So Crisis Text Line was born of the rib of Do Something. It's
Eve to your Adam, basically.
Exactly. So we send a lot of text messages to Do Something. That's the way we communicate with young people. And we were getting text messages back from kids having nothing to do with our campaigns, but they're used to communicating through social media. They think of it as private and anonymous. So we got a message from a girl who said she was being raped by her father, which is not what we do at Do Something. And we thought, we really need to do something for her. We need to build this. There needs to be a hotline that's by text. So it's now just over 2 years old, and we have processed almost 9 million messages. We're doing about 25,000 messages a day now. If some of you can't imagine, for some of you, it's hard to imagine people sending to a stranger something as intimate and horrific as, my father, he won't stop raping me, it's my dad, stranger to stranger. But that is, I think, very this generation. Not even hearing a voice, but we spike every day at lunchtime. Kids are at lunch in the cafeteria. Every day we have a spike during lunchtime. They're sitting at the table and they're texting us these intimate things. The other thing that's interesting about this day and age is, so it's very effective helping these kids, but also because it's words, we can use AI and natural language processes to auto-tag all of the words in real time, which means we are now sitting on the largest map of crises in America. So
how does it segment? What are some of the insights from that?
So, and we've made it all public. So it's open, as opposed to if we were an old power company, we would probably be selling it.
Right.
Instead, we've put it under Creative Commons license, and anybody here can look it up. It's at crisistrends.org, and you can see, guess what the worst time of day is for substance abuse? So it's 5 a.m. You can see the worst state for suicidal ideation, Montana, Alaska, Colorado. You can see the relationship between issues. We've anonymized it, pulled all the personally identifiable information, but the data is also very freeing. Another organization who could be here, right, is Donors Choose. Donors Choose, you pay for projects in classrooms, but think about the data set that they're sitting on, and they've opened up an API so you can access it, and you can see where teachers are desperate for science equipment because it's not funded in that state, or where nobody is funding, class trips. So the other thing I think that's exciting about these structures is that the information that we're collecting, storing, and analyzing, we are also, many of us, opening so that other people can access it, and we're creating ecosystems instead of companies. We're creating platforms instead of movements, if that makes sense.
And I think, to me, what this raises is the question of new power to what end, right? And so there isn't anything inherently good just about a new power structure if what ultimately happens is, that's in service of what ISIS is doing, which is using mass participation and a highly decentralized model to propagate violence and extremism. And I think it raises this question of the responsibility that we all have to really think about how we can empower our networks and do these things for higher purposes, right? So the question, if you are a Facebook, is, when are you making trade-offs that favor the interests of your users and give them more agency and power, and give them some of the value that you're creating, because they're creating hundreds of billions of dollars worth of value, and when are you just keeping that at the top? And I think, as Scott alluded to, I think the big question is, will these new power leaders start pushing power down into the network and out into society, or will it end up being a lot of people participating, but all the value captured at the top? And what these guys are doing, which is incredibly inspiring, and the people on this stage, is using new power to meaningfully give power to the people who are in the most difficult circumstances.
Well, just to say something, I think, you mentioned the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts. So those are highly distributed organizations, which are, I don't know, extraordinarily old, right? And there used to be lots of leagues, right? Social leagues and bowling leagues and this league and that league. So in some ways, this notion of people aggregating and organizing at the edge of the network isn't new. I think what's new is, again, opening it up and not monetizing it, if you will, for private gain, but for the public good. And what's enabling it, the people who had a hard time finding each other, these technologies that allow them to come together. So in some ways, new power actually sounds pretty old to me. It's just upgrading it or updating it with new systems.
But I do think we have to think about sort of capitalist society and fiduciary duty, and how we're going to sort of marry these two, right? Which is, CEOs and corporate boards aren't evil. They have fiduciary duty to give as much return to their shareholders as possible. I think B Corps have helped solve that for a number of organizations. But I do think we have to think more about how do we guide corporate America to think about that they can still fulfill their fiduciary duty, still maximize shareholder return, and yet push some of this power down. And I think that's one of the things I'd love people's thoughts on, but that's one of the things that
well, actually, maybe maximizing shareholder return isn't, making a ton of money is fine. I'm running a company where we are profitable. We're going to become really profitable, but we'll be fine being a $200 million a year revenue company, and maybe we don't need to be a $1 billion revenue company. We want to serve 1 billion people. We want to benefit 1 billion people, but why the hell do we need to be a $1 billion revenue company? What's wrong with just making a lot of money and not a super lot of money? So
I think that's right. No, I think that's right, but I think a lot of people are signing up when they're signing up a CEO to maximize returns, right? That is something that, and so it is a struggle, and I totally agree with you, and I think if you start an organization with that purpose in mind, it's one thing. I think coming from an old pharma company or from something else, it's a harder transition to make.
So what I'll just say I think is interesting is, again, I get back to the crisistimes.org, that's what it's called?
Crisis Trends.
Crisis Trends.
TRENDS.
So it's like we need to measure success differently. So if all we think about is maximizing EPS, that might not be the metric that, if you're playing the long game, ultimately matters. Yeah. We need more dimensional ways to think about value creation. And I'm hearing multiple ways to think about that.
And I think what Jenny's raising is this question of like how these new power models live within an old power superstructure, because the capital markets are what they are, and so the incentives for an Uber or a Facebook to not push power down are very strong. And so over time, you're going to want to see these new power models not just operate within the superstructure, but ultimately change that superstructure. So where you get crowd investing models and other ways in which the structural incentives change, or you enable more companies like Kickstarter and Meetup to do their thing without having VCs breathing down their neck saying, this ain't possible. So I want to thank everybody. This has been a really great panel. I think the wide-ranging discussion shows just how big the implications of some of this are. I want to thank my dear colleague Henry, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you in the weeks ahead. Thanks so much.